And I'd like to just commend Ballynahinch and Occasional Press for this project, this extraordinary dual set of books, because it clarified for me a lot of Dorothy's material, a lot of her installation, a lot of her object making in ways I hadn't thought about before. Probably another nice thing to say is that this evening, this afternoon, Dorothy texted me and said, I'm on my way. And I said, I'm out watching a man catching a sea trout and thinking about sex and death. Because that's kind of what Dorothy brings you to, thinking about, you know. And in both volumes, they both finish with images of the sea. In one, in Montenotte, I think it's just the sea. And in Fountainstown, it's you in the wormhole in the Arons.
Well, I was asked that question yesterday, and when I answered it, the interviewer said, well, that's what everybody says. So it's not that different than anybody else's passion, I think. I think it's also because of our limitations, you know, as humans on this planet. It's still one of those undiscovered realms. And because I came to live here because of scuba diving, that's what lured me here. I went to the fabulous Grays in Scuba Dive West and qualified at scuba diving. And when you're diving, you're held in a realm that is almost disembodies yourself. So it brings you into a territory that is not like being grounded. So that effect helped me maybe become even more passionate about the sea.
But isn't it, you've always had this great sort of understanding of the power of nature, and the power of nature, the way it both externally, as we view it in a sort of a geographical sense, but also internally. And I'm thinking particularly there of your combination of in chiasm of opera, of love lost, of the surge of the sea, of this great ebb and flow of emotional attachment.
Yes, and for people who don't know what chiasm is, it was an opera I did in some handball alleys in County Galway, where we projected the wormhole on the Aran Islands into the floors of the alleys. And the idea was that it never actually fitted. The proportions were very similar to the floors of the alleys, but you had this natural rectangle of the ocean attempting to fit into the structure of the concrete. But I think what intrigues me about that, and then opera singers came in and walked on these projections. It was very, very beautiful, actually. And they sang fragments of operas, just tiny fragments in 9 different languages on love and loss. So it is about the fact that nothing is constant, and even if desire exists, you're always going to experience desire in a different way. It's never ever going to be the same.
And that, I mean, that's very ambitious, like, project. I mean, a lot of contemporary artists don't go near those big issues. In visual arts, we don't tend to tackle those major projects.
That's an interesting one, but Patrick, being a curator, you are the one who engenders. And I must just point out here before I go any further, when I first came back to live in Ireland, I had lived out of the country for 10 years, and I came back and was, you know, rattling around in a basement flat and, you know, building sculptures on my kitchen table, and I had no money. And Murph gave me my first show in the Douglas Hyde, and I remember saying to him, the Douglas Hyde is a beautiful, beautiful space in Trinity College, and it's still a beautiful space. And you enter it from above. It's a very unusual art space, so that you're looking down into it like looking into Ballynahinch or something. Actually, so architecturally, it's a fantastic space. And you offered me a show, which I'm still eternally grateful for. And I remember saying, it's too big, I can't do it. And you said, yes, you can. And I was going, oh, Jesus. And but then it was that kind of faith. So I think the problem with, you know, and I don't know how many of you in the audience are artists, it's the limitations. Are they self-imposed, or are they institutionally imposed, or are they market imposed? I think I don't believe in limitations in terms of possibility. Of course, they're all there, you know, because of how we live and being on this planet. But I remember when we did the Ghost Ship, the budget was first £40,000, and I thought that was fantastic. And then, because the paint cost so much money, it went up and up and up and up and up. And it was, in the end, it was 110,000. And it didn't mean that any of us got any more money, but the paint cost so much money, nearly all went up the paint. But I remember sitting in a pub with people afterwards, and they were saying that then the next year 100,000 was offered, and people didn't rise to the 100,000. And I think it's because we're so, especially for something that is never going to sell and get the money back. I think a lot of younger artists aren't allowed to imagine that big. I don't know where I got the gene to allow myself to do it, but with Nissan, after that, very few people came up with ideas that might cost that much money. It's almost like there was a prohibition around it. So where I allow myself, I'm not too sure, but unfortunately sometimes I do, it stymies. It also stymies because you can't do things sometimes.
But I think they have the projects in mind, and I mean, and there's been a number of major, I mean, productions that I say almost get into the realm of the operatic, which, you know, as a form is a real. I remember Conor Fan saying years ago that the sign of the real marker of a civilization is how it deals with sentimentality, you know, because we all have sentiment, and to a great extent contemporary art has excluded sentiment, not contemporary music. But I'm thinking of the Sabbath Matter, and then the remarkable thing you did in Doolin, you know, with the singer in the cave.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you've never you actually implicate nature as part of the theatre of your art.
But you see, it's there. So, you know, why not? It's the two projects Patrick's mentioned. There's a cave on Valentia Island that's an old slate quarry, and I was down there making a film about jellyfish, and I just went there and immediately thought, you have to have an opera here. It's a fantastic combination of things. There's a Holy Mary up 90 feet up in a hole in a cliff, and it was made into a Marian shrine in the 50s, but it was also a slate quarry, and the slate was used for roofing the Houses of Parliament in London, the Paris Opera House, so it's this fantastic history of kind of the stone itself, but also it was just this fantastic amphitheatre. So it's somehow when those places present themselves, it just gives an arena for something to trigger it. And very often that's the art, and it can be something very simple, like a woman floating in the middle of the Aran Islands. I photographed myself, but it was just any old, it doesn't matter who it was, a woman floating in the middle of Pal na Beist. And suddenly then what you get is scale, you get the human connection to the nature. And normally if you're a tourist and you just go and look at the Grand Canyon, you don't have that trigger other than your own experience. So I think if you're going to take something like that and harness it and make it into what might be art, you have to kind of position something in relationship to it. And what I did in this extraordinary cave in County Clare recently was the second biggest stalactite in the world is in this cave in County Clare, and you should all go and see it because it is majestic. And it's 7 meters long, and it's pure white, and it's the only stalactite in the cave. And I was looking for stalactites on Googling them for something else, and I went, oh my God, it's just down the road. And I went to see it, and the people who own it, that's the other thing in terms of, you know, how art happens, is the energy of people around it. The people who owned the stalactite allowed me bring in a little boy soprano to sing underneath it. And his voice was just breaking. His name is Ben Escorcio. He's got a very beautiful voice. And so we built a little platform underneath this extraordinary thing, and he sang sounds, but there were only sounds. They weren't words. And that stalactite is between 600,000 and 1 million years old. It was only found, I think, in the 50s or 60s by someone scrambling in, you know, a caver. And then these people got permission to put steps down there, and now anyone can go there. But again, when I went there first, I went, you know, perfect and singular. So therefore, it wasn't going to be a Stabat Mater, which is, you know, an orchestrated piece with 2 singers. I wanted the potential, actually, of the little boy, the potential of sound, to be placed below. And this is frustrating for all you sitting there. We should go, here it is, and give you a look. Yeah. But you can find most of them on the net. But and he just, I wanted him to be like a little baby bird, as if he was learning to sing. Sound. And there was no Bach, Mozart, you know, Shostakovich, that it was unrecognizable potential, you know?
And probably in geological time to human time, probably the right proportion.
Exactly,
right? Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. You all, what about then, how did you find the theatrical experience? Because then you did Riders to the Sea. So when you move into sort of the artificiality of a theatre space, was that very different?
Yes, it is very different. I did an opera with my friend Fiona Shaw in English National Opera in London about 3 years ago, And she is an actress who was asked to direct, and we had nearly worked on projects before that didn't happen. We could write a book on projects that didn't happen, but it was Riders to the Sea. So Fiona asked me would I design it. So suddenly you're faced with a giant proscenium, which actually is the biggest in London, which suited us fine. And the difference is, an artist, we might be control freaks, but when you work alone so much, it's very, very hard. In some ways, it's very hard. Me and Fiona think very much alike, but there was another designer on board. There's also a giant budget. There's also, I suppose, you don't have the weather, you don't have all that fantastic kind of accidental thing. But I think I had to compromise on one or two things, which didn't suit me. Okay. But in general, and I had worked on operas before in one in Kilmainham Jail, and I preferred that. But it was still, you're still quite, it's still a little bit too controlled. I do prefer doing things in caves or in things like that.
Where you can be, where it's your gig.
It's my gig.
Yeah. You don't have to deal with other people. That's
right.
That thing about, I mean, if you want, that's the sort of the enormous public work and this is the performative work and also it's time that you have to be there to see it, you know, those works. But there's another part to the practice which is much more studio based, which is much more, say, hand based. And how important is that to you as a regular beat?
Oh, it's incredibly important, I think. I kind of yearn for it, actually, because the past year I haven't had it. And, you know, to explain again to people who mightn't know my work very well, you know, one day I might make a sculpture that's a walrus whisker attached to a thimble, and I'd be very happy. But the thimble and the walrus whisker might have been in my studio for, you know, 10 years, and then suddenly I'll get the idea to put them together, because it's about humans' removal from sense and ultra sense of whisker. But you know, that little coming together is a flash. And so that kind of making is about muddling around, but I do adore that. Yeah, I do, yeah.
We also adore, I mean, I think it's with you, it's the studio is full of potential things to become art, because again, the idea of the found object or the object that you've brought with you throughout your life, these things hang around until that moment when you animate.
They do, and you can't force them, and that's where you know, I sometimes envy artists who kind of know what they're going to do next. You know, maybe nobody does, but sometimes I feel painters do, that they have some kind of range. Maybe I'm wrong. Painters here might be wrong, so it is about the thing in some ways sometimes telling you. And for years I worked with things that belonged to my parents, and in the books you'll see some of the results of that. I would gather stuff like dish covers that we had our roast chicken under on Saturdays in our bourgeois upbringing, and then I would take them, and of course I would never put them over a roast chicken in my own house, so they would hang around. But then they might work themselves into something that then I get rid of by showing it and hopefully selling it. They're not too quick, some of them, to move on, but I often talk about that as a kind of a disinheritance. And then I went through all the things that belonged to my parents. I have very few left now. And then I came to live in Connemara, and you know, I found a whale on the shore, and I was thrilled. And I got my lovely friend John Gibbons, who's sadly not with us anymore, a neighbour, to carry it up on his digger to my house. So then it was another kind of claymation or reclamation of stuff, you know. And the whale stayed in my field for 3 years smelling until he became clean. So that thing of having stuff around, you know, sometimes I think I yearn to be nomadic, but I think there is something about being an artist that, well, certainly for me, I couldn't go with my easel and walk up a mountain, and I need to surround.
That thing about being nomadic, what was a real revelation to me in the book was Fountainstown, because I'd never seen Fountainstown before, and I'd never seen the way the shed was organised. And then I thought, God, the Barna building on the fields in Connemara had the same sort of all opened up in the front, sort of regimental laying out of bunk and the bare necessities of what you needed to live. But it really was a direct connection.
Yes, yeah. One of these books is called Fountainstown, one is called Montenotte. Montenotte is the neighbourhood in Cork where I was brought up in a big old house. And then my father had a little hut by the sea and a lovely little bay called Fountainstown, which is just outside Cork Harbour. And he had a shed there before he ever met my mother, and it was kind of tar paper and wood. And he used to go sailing from there. But when I moved to Connemara, I couldn't afford a house, and I found a field down in Mullaghgloss, and there was no planning permission, so I built sheds, and I lived in the sheds. And I actually have tons of what is in my father's shed in my shed.
In your
So
shed,
is that
yeah.
kind of weird, or kind of compulsive, or I don't know, that because a lot of it's not valuable stuff, but a wooden spike that was used for making rope knots and things, that I consider beautiful, that hasn't gone into a piece of work yet. But maybe the desire would be that in the end it's all gone. When I'm gone, it's all gone. Or do you leave it behind? I don't know. But I don't like the idea of accumulation at all. I hate the idea of accumulation.
Well, it's interesting that you hate it because you're a sub-accumulator, right?
Yeah, but it's not. It's mostly what people throw away.
Yeah, but
if you think
I
about
think
it.
that's but inevitably it lies in the studio dormant until such time as whatever sparks it off that morning, it animates, and it's usually the two different elements being put together to make a third to go into a third element. I mean, again, I thought for me within the books, which I'd sort of guessed at, or, like you say, like the ghost ship is obvious. Or it's not obvious. It's maybe mythic, and maybe we know it, but we haven't seen it, And I see you doing things. So, but when I saw the Storm in the Teacup, which is two very nice china porcelain teacups, whatever, that's projected in the Flaherty movie of the men in Men of Iron, it's like to have that in the Montenotte book, really struck me about how you both from the idea that you venture forth into nature, but then you understand the absolutely corseting of nature that occurs in domesticity by the way it performs.
Corseting is a lovely word. But I suppose we all have. That's the only way, because we're corseted by our own body, our bodily experience. Sadly, in a way, because wouldn't it be wonderful if we could expand from that limitation? So sometimes I look back at works and think, oh God, everything's so limited, and wouldn't it be wonderful to, I'm dying for something to be, discovered, that we can access something more outside our planet. So it seems to be this eternal kind of reconsideration of things around us. But when something becomes broader, that's when it's exciting. So if you see a teacup with a little storm in it, it's kind of magic. It's impossible to.
But it's also a cliche.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
It is
but it's
completely.
magic.
Yeah.
And I mean, and I think that was the interesting thing about the ghost ship. It's like, what happened with the ghost ship is like this big rig was set up off the ghost ship, so the lights would go on and fire up basically the paint, the phosphorescent paint, and then they'd switch off, and then you had a ghost ship. And it was like a magician showing you the trick and then doing the trick. And it didn't make any difference that you knew how the trick was done. It was still a great revelation to see it, because we've heard of ghost ships, we didn't see it, right?
Yeah.
The other thing about the ghost ship was the ship was the lightship from Roche's Point.
The ship was called the Albatross. It was built in 1928, and it was shot by my father. I found it in his photographic albums, because the photographs in these books are all from my father's albums. And he had shot it in the 30s, and it was the same ship. And I knew that in 1999 when I did it, and I was really excited about it. Because I found the photograph in the album, and my God, it's the same ship. And he was dead for quite a long time, so I was really happy that it was some kind of
that
thing.
reoccurring, reoccurring. Yeah. And so I mean, again, when you can sort of geological Dorothy Cross, and then there's biological Dorothy Cross, or the fauna of Dorothy Cross, which is one of the most compelling ones is the shark, which comes up again and again in your work.
Who was I talking to about a shark yesterday? About fear. When I was younger and living in California, I guinea pigged myself to the Jungian Institute to do psychoanalysis. I didn't have enough money to pay the full boys, so I went to the students, and I used to have loads of dreams about sharks. And some of them were covered in yellow velvet, and I'd wake up in the morning and go, God, and then go to the shrink and talk about it. And then in the early days, I wanted to use images that were they were potent for everybody, because I I had kind of spilled into art language a little bit, and I realized that I'm the kind of person who actually wants to work with things that are common to all of us, but we all have different responses to them, obviously. Thank God, too. But so the shark, number one, is one of the most ancient animals on the planet. It hasn't had to evolve for millions of years. It's been decimated by the Japanese and Chinese finning, which is so appalling. They're really been under threat. But it's the singularity of the shark has always interested me. That potential threat that it might attack. So there's something I identify with sharks, because when I first started diving in the Galapagos Islands and was brought down to hammerheads, I thought, Jesus Christ, first. And then you're there with them. And you realize they're living their own life and taking no notice of you. But I think there is an identification there. There's something about misunderstanding. That's one of the biggest problems. And maybe misunderstanding is the wrong word, but there's something about the norm in the world that we're told to understand in a certain way. So misunderstanding is the wrong word. So that the poor shark, you turn on the TV, and actually I bet if you went home tonight and turned on the TV, you get a shark fin in Jaws or something in some channel, talking about them in such a destructive, nasty way. And that's so wrong. And in some ways, art exists in a way that is under threat, I think, and is not respected. And I can see why, because we shoot ourselves in the foot a lot with our own way of dealing with it. But because it's a non-verbal territory, and because it's held down by the bad press of value and money and celebrity shit, and also academic language sometimes can be to its detriment. Yep. But so I'm talking. I've gone from the shark, but I think maybe I'm talking about the shark and art being maybe similar animals. You know,
misunderstood. Whatever.
That sounds a bit kind of craven, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I mean, in many instances with the shark, you feminize the shark.
Yes.
By giving it breasts.
Yes.
And so that was like, I suppose, where was that leading us? Was it the idea that the female can be as dangerous and as predatory as the non-gendered shark?
Yes. All my early work, again for people who don't know, but in the 90s I made a lot of work that was very blatantly about gender, and it was more about the accoutrements, breasts, penises, things like that we're born with. We can't really do much about unless you have a sex change, and we have to then navigate the world with our appendages. And I was very conscious as a young woman that, actually as a very, very young girl, that my brother had to fight the bullies up the road, and he might have to go to war, and I didn't have to because I was a girl. So I felt terribly sorry for my brother, and I was really glad I was a girl. So a lot of that early work is about claiming all those abominable things as well as positive things on both sides, on either side of the So the male thing in particular, and there's a piece of work called Family, and I love this piece of work, but a lot of people think it's really ridiculous. And it's a set of spider crabs that I found in an old lobster pot, actually in a little killery, and they were all dried, and they were very beautiful and perfect. And then Patrick's sister, very beautifully, Sarah Flaherty, cast them for me in bronze. And there's a big one, a medium one, and a little one. So what you do, it's like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, you make a family. And so Daddy Crab, Mummy Crab, and Baby Crab. And Daddy Crab has a big penis on his back, as a daddy would. Yeah. And it looks like a kind of a cannon. Yeah. And he's there, on the ground, and Mummy and Baby, you can play with them, you can put them in different positions. But it's almost like this pathetic appendage that this poor crab has to kind of carry on his back and protect his wife and baby. And that's what it's about. And a crab is exoskeletal, so it's got its hardness on the outside. And this penis is always, I've felt, there's this awful thing you men have to deal with, is that you're tough guys and that they're these rock hard, impenetrable, non-vulnerable things. And, that's as bad as us being, pathetic. I remember
like a classic one of yours to me at one stage was, Murph, they keep mixing up the phallus with the penis, and I like that's the idea that the phallus, the idea of the sexual strength, wasn't just a male thing, that there could be the female phallus if people allow the imagination to stretch.
That's right.
Yeah. God, we're going to go after that.
Back to nature.
Back to nature. I mean, one of the most touching pieces I know, and again, I think this a great allowance you do, because what you're saying is really that you want to develop a language of art that's accessible. Right? You really sense that the viewer is allowed in. Where some of art these days starts off from a position of a sort of a private or a sort of a disciplined conversation between people who know. And one of the most touching things that I know from you is Cry, which was a big installation, but nevertheless within that there was what they call snake lovers.
Well, this was a piece of work called Lover Snakes, which at one point snakes also are maligned. Jellyfish are maligned. I've done a lot of work with animals who are kind of rejected and considered awful. And snakes have been ruined by the Catholic Church. You know, the Queen of Heaven scrunched it under her heel, and of course it tempted Adam and Eve and all the rest of it. But so I got these snakes in a scientific supplier in America, who bred them for science. And at the time I was looking at those symbols that were so kind of potent again. And when I was gutting the snake, I found its little heart, and I was so touched by the fact that the snake had a heart. It was like a little kidney bean. Of course, the snake had a heart, but it was just, it shocked me at the time. And, you know, it is quite brutal to skin a... Mind you, I had found the sharks in mackerel when we were kids and found it on, you know, gutting mackerel. But I made little silver reliquaries for the hearts, and then I intertwined the two snakes, so they were lover snakes, and they had the little hearts. So it was about trying to kind of bring emote and bring love into something as most people think repulsive as a snake.
And it did. And it's only one of your smaller pieces, but really is, say, a compelling image. And then the other thing was the cowhides and the others. And the other was a great play on the other, which we were all involved in back in the 90s as regards discussing art. But you mind that for a while, but it hasn't really reoccurred.
That's the other thing I think, you know, repeating. I don't really like repeating stuff, but for people who don't know the work, in early 90s or late 80s, I went to Norway to do a project, and I found a sieve in a little kind of a folk museum made out of the udder of a cow, and it was like a baron with the 4 teats and little holes drilled, and it was very, you know, it was the Norwegians being very practical. They used it as a sieve. And I was just mesmerised, and I thought it was like the most extraordinary surrealist object I'd seen since Merritt Oppenheim's Fur Teacup. And I came back to Ireland and tried to find someone to skin the cows the wrong way round so I could get the udders, and which in itself was quite a tricky thing. But there was a man who used to kill them for his greyhounds for meat, and he used to supply them before EU regulations. And they'd arrive to me very wet and smelly in my studio. And you know, I don't delight in this kind of stuff, but you kind of go through it to make something that in the end isn't repulsive. But there's an awful lot that is not my nature to be gutting and things like that, you know. But I know when I'm doing it that it's leading to something at the end. Actually, that isn't going to be about that process. Do
you know where you're going when you're doing that process, or you just know that through the process something will?
With the others, I knew exactly where I was going. It was the first 2 years, it was the early 90s, 91 to 92. I knew the shock and the power I felt from the sieve. Yeah. And I knew exactly that it was going to do that. And actually, it might be a bit shocking to some of you, but I've made about 22 works with cow's teats. You know, putting them on the toes of stiletto-heeled shoes that referred to bound feet. Yeah, they had such power in themselves that I almost had to do nothing. I would get up, I had a studio down in Wicklow in a beautiful old glass house. There was an architectural kind of, it was all broken up, and I worked there for 2 years. And I just walk in, and it was delightful. I didn't really have to worry about anything. They just told me what to do with themselves. It sounds stupid, but it seemed so simple. But then I remember there was a time in the early 90s where I was in a show called Bad Girls in London, which was such a stupid title, and it was all women, and it was got really bad press, which was another that's a whole other conversation. But somebody wanted to buy all these cows. Saatchi wanted to buy all these cows, actually, and I refused at the time because I felt the whole thing could become this kind of, you could end up with kind of teats on everything for the rest of your life. So, but it was funny because I don't know if you remember this story. I had a dream that I went into Macy's store in New York and everything was covered in teats. And I woke up in the morning and went, oh my God, you know, there were hats with teats and gloves with teats. And I could have become very rich, actually. I could have probably done them and every museum in the world would have one. But I hate that. I hate this reproduction. I hate Damien Hirst's spot paintings. I hate that it undermines art. And how can anyone value art if it's just a production line? But the final piece of the others was, I had never, the thing about the single teats of the cows is that a cow has 4 teats, obviously. And, but when you take, I made one piece called Amazon, she's in the book, and I called her Amazon because she was on a tailor's dummy and she only had 1 teat. And in mythology, the Amazonian warriors supposedly cut off 1 teat so they could shoot their bows and arrows more accurately. And what had happened was that the man had delivered the skin. It only had 1 teat on it. I had paid him £100. I was totally broke and I was nearly crying because it only had 1 teat. And then I saw that 1 teat was actually doing exactly what these teats, it was this absolute flip-flop penis teat. Because it was a big black one. It was exactly like the folds of a penis. And I went, oh my God. And I used to actually hide them if some people came into my studio. But Murph came into my studio. I never placed it genitally. This is such a weird conversation. No, but you know, and then I decided I'd do this thing, and it's quite shocking. I'll tell you a story about it in a minute. But I decided I would place it genitally. So I got a pair of girls' white knickers. Most of us have a pair of regular Dunnes Stores knickers in our drawers. So I very perfectly got my sewing machine and machined the teat inside the gusset of the knickers. And I went, oh God, Dorothy, this is the end, you really, you know. And Murph came to visit me in my studio. And I went, Murph, look what I've made, it's just so weird. And you said, but you can buy them in sex shops in New York City. And then, made of
there
rubber.
Goes my reputation.
And then a friend of mine who's a shrink came in and was in heaven. She was just in heaven. She was writing theses about it and everything. So, but that, you know, it was actually, sometimes it's about other people coming in and saying it's okay, you know, because I nearly threw it into the river when I was.
But I think that's, I mean, and I think that, you know, where we're all going, you can appreciate this with the conversation is like, this is where you bring us to. You know what I mean? This is, and there is a humour in it, and there's also a shock, and there's also this great recognition. And you said to me a few minutes ago, like, bring me back to accessibility.
You see, accessibility is tricky. If you start talking about work being accessible, yes, of course, I think any artwork in the world is accessible. But there's an awful problem these days of language. Let's make art accessible, you know, let's make art community art. Immediately, you're in trouble. Because art is only accessible if the viewer is in a position where they can register something that affects their lives. Now, that could be anybody's work. So I think the accessibility thing comes in, and in my later life at the moment, I'm talking more about it. But then the other thing is too, like my version, the way I talk about this is only my version. You know, hopefully you guys go and see the work and have your own response to it, and don't think, oh, just because Dorothy thinks this is what it is. I remember Fellini being interviewed once and asked why he used that fantastic big blonde busty one in Dolce Vita. And he was sitting in the chair and he said, which version will I give tonight? And it's, you know, you can speak about things in versions, and I think what those books do, and when we were working on it, myself and Vincent Murphy, for weeks and weeks and weeks, and put this photograph, that photograph, we could have made 10,000 versions of that book. Yeah. So it's like how you meet the Mona Lisa, it's how you meet Picasso. It's if you've got a nasty, nasty teacher who tells you Rembrandt's the best, and you hate Rembrandt for the rest of your life, you know. So accessibility, I think we really have to be careful about language.
Yeah, well, I think we do.
Yeah.
Because I think that there's the Victorian idea that art is good for you, which I don't subscribe to at all. I think it necessarily has to be good for you at all.
Did the Victorians say that?
Yeah, so that's why they had that great educated thing that art had to have a social use. But Robert Gober said a beautiful thing about art, and I actually wrote it down because I wanted to bring it up this evening. And he said that art is the thing that makes life more interesting than art.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's really where art the best of art stands. It brings us back to life, and we realise we use art in order to understand life better, not necessarily art as an end in itself. Again, for me, one of the progressions of understanding you and the work you make has been the idea of the studios that I've known you in. You know, from the basement in Pembroke, whatever, in Leeson Park, to the powerhouse. I don't know how you got access, but talk a little bit about working there.
Yeah, I worked there for 4 years. How did I get access? I can't remember. There was a kind of enterprise centre in an old hotel next to Pigeon House, and I worked there for 6 months, and then I used to wander through this old power station, and somehow I got access to it because health and safety, you know,
At the window,
the window. But then Patrick was working in the ICA in Philadelphia at the time, and this is actually the whole thing of. There was this big control room. It was amazing. It was like Tarkovsky. And it actually had been built by the Germans, Siemens Sickert. And there were amazing stories about it. I found pictures of Hitler and Goering on the backs of locker doors. And I was thinking, geez. And the Virgin Mary on one and then Hitler on the other. Very peculiar.
JF Kennedy wasn't around then.
No,
Right?
and all the pin-up girls, I think, had gone to the new power station. But what we did was I was so entranced by this building, and we basically went in and robbed most of the things and brought them to Philadelphia, to Murph's fabulous space over there, and put on a show called Powerhouse, and then actually brought them back again, like looking back on it, and we put them back into the Powerhouse. And they're still there, like, you know. And 1 or 2 pop videos were made in there. It was an extraordinary building. Very sadly, it's allowed to go to rack and ruin. It would have been a fantastic museum of modern art.
But the way you talked at the beginning, when we talked about the sea and about diving in the sea and about this idea of disembodiment, there was that same sense of exploration within those vast turbine halls of that space. I mean, you were diminutive within the scale of the building.
Yeah, yeah. It was fantastic. I only actually rented 400 square feet, but it was massive. It was massive, massive. And I'd wander around with a torch, and it was full of pigeons, and found things, you know, and found things that kind of, a bit like a thimble or a walrus thing or whatever, triggered works. Because also it was redundant. I'm very interested in what is redundant or derelict and why it is cast aside. And how that can affect us in our present situation. Because maybe it's the only way you can do it, because you can't, in some ways, what's the future? This is the problem, isn't it? So you mirror yourself, you don't know. And it's a precipice. And, you know, in some ways it's, do you run out of all these extraordinary places? You know, where do you find something that's going to trigger the next thing? If you found one whale, if you find another, is it the same? You know, it is material that feeds you to kind of excite you into, and there were these machines in the power station that were called exciters. It was fantastic. They literally were. And what did they say on them again? There were all these Bakelite signs, and if you lit them from underneath, de-excitation. Wasn't that it? It was to make the level of energy of electricity to go lower, de-excitation. So all the language was actually emotive and kind of physical and almost sexual. And then you went in next door to the modern ESB, and it was all numbers, and all that passion of energy was gone.
It's left, yeah.
So it had become neutral. And so, you know, the territory to take from, you know, maybe one runs out, I don't know.
But is that sort of, do you feel sometimes that you it's imperative that you go towards the novel, that you find the next unusual thing?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. Is it novel, though? Is anything novel? But I think it has to be novel for yourself. And I tried to talk about this the other day somewhere in terms of desire and passion. Oh yeah, it was about how you encounter art. And it's almost like, not only my own art, if you, like we all, thank God, get excited about some, like maybe when you're 17 you fall in love with Bacon or whoever, and then it's almost like you have this love affair with viewing Francis Bacon, and then it's like you absorb it, you start to know it, and then, and I was saying, is it like a love affair in real life? Does something shift molecularly, and your relationship with Bacon is different, and then you move on and you want to, you fall in love with Giacometti or Mantegna, And it doesn't have to be a more modern artist either. You know, you can go back to Mantegna.
I just was in whatever Prado for the first time about 3 weeks ago, and it was did the hits. But then where I really found the whole aesthetic and the reward of the visit was with Cranach and Bruegel and Bosch and Roger van der Weyden. And I'm here in this Northern European rooms of the Prado, where it's got the great Spanish tradition, and that's what excited me. And then later on in the day, looking at Wangri and Dali and people like, and it looked like adolescent to what I've been involved in in the morning. And I thought that was quite a strange. I still haven't quite unpicked what happened that day, but something happened that I still have to totally understand. But the validity of the artistic experience is not based on something on time or period.
No.
It's based on encounter and how you're whether open to those encounters. You know. But you have, I mean, like you have dived in the Antarctica, and on a glacial face. You know, you've been with shark singers in, where was that, Micronesia?
In Papua New Guinea.
Papua New Guinea, you know, and then swimming in jellyfish lakes in Micronesia. I mean, art has brought you. The world really is the extended studio.
Yeah, well, it is, isn't it? Why, you know, I again, though, maybe I envy people who go in and have the canvas. Sometimes I do, you know, because it takes a lot of energy to take. And also, the world is getting what it is. I sympathise with younger people. Like when I went to some places in the early days, it was really still very primitive. Papua New Guinea still is, but it's becoming very generic. You know, they all have the Lonely Planet guides, and it's becoming generic. And I worry about that in terms of the new generation, and that's why one hopes that we find some kind of meteor or something lands on us soon, and we have some access to something else.
Disrupts it.
Yeah.
And I think again in some of your work that deals with the incredibly beauty and destructive power of love, you know, and I say that's a pretty tall, you know, phrase, but that's still there. That's still palpable, and will be palpable for every generation to do that. I just hope artists are ambitious enough to deal with some of these major conundrums of being a human being and what happens in your lifetime, but paradoxically sometimes in one's lifetime. But
they need people like you too, giving them the show and the Douglas Hyde. You see that's desperately needed. The faith, even if there is no track record much, and there wasn't much with me when you gave me that show, you know, that there has to be that faith to fall in your face too.
Well, there was no one making tracks. I think that at that stage there was nothing but, you know, there was very little, and so the Douglas Hyde could forge a history. And it's something I always go on about with Irish art, is that no one else is going to tell the story of Irish art, but we have to self-determine that story, and no one's going to come in from abroad and do it. And I think there's a lot of work not being done on that, and now we're losing generations. In that, if you even look at the sort of the 50s and 60s and people like Jerry Dillon like there were stories in the 80s about those guys because they had just passed away, and now the oral history's going, and now you're just left with the stark, you know, job of research. But that needs to be captured now in order to give your work for 50 years from now at the backstory of where it came from and how it came out. You know? Questions?
You know, film and well, it's John Berger still inspires me. God Almighty, John Berger, who's a fantastic Englishman who lives in France and writes. If you haven't read anything of his, but film does, and there still are a few artists. Like earlier on, I was talking to Murph about Gary Hill, Robert Goby you mentioned. You know, thank goodness there are still the ones that still inspire. You know, so yeah, and movies in particular. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Because yes, immediately it's as if Damien Hirst owned every shark in the world. But for the show I was doing with Murph years ago on ICA, I tried to rent a shark in Boston, and I got onto this guy in the aquarium before Damien Hirst was out of his short pants, and I nearly rented one to put in a tank, but then when it doesn't really matter. Of course, sometimes it makes it easier if there's a shark in formaldehyde in a museum and my shark is hanging gilded inside his skin. Sometimes it's easier because then there's a conversation that can happen for the viewer. But you know, I could talk about Damien Hirst's shark for a long time. I think one big difference is I would never just get an animal and put it on display. I have this kind of madly annoying urge to shift it into another territory. So when I had the shark in my studio, the skin of a shark, he hung there for quite a long time before I decided to put gold leaf on the inside, which then suddenly you have this animal that has been skinned and it's brutal. You know, the animal is gone, it's dead, but the skin still remains almost like the shell of an egg. And somehow by putting 400 pounds worth of gold leaf inside, you're making something valuable from something that's throwaway. And I think that's maybe a difference between, although Damien does do different things. The shark is probably one of his more just singular, put it in a tank. You know, he does change other things, but that's the biggest difference, I think.
The interesting thing about the Hearst shark, because it came out when I was living in the States, and it was this whole white young British artist phenomenon. And I remember going over to check it out to find out, you know, what I thought about all this thing. When you actually, and it was all written about the predatory, and it had a brilliant title. Well, the impossibility of death in the heart of the living. The title was great, but when you actually looked at the shark, which completely collapsed the whole piece for me, you could see the rope marks where it had been hauled. So instead of this machine of death, it became something pathetic. And no one talked about the rope marks.
Nobody. It was brutalization.
And that's what I really like. That you really have to look at objects, and I think that the thing about British art is it's like British comedy. It's generational. You know, it keeps going from generation to generation, and then there's very few people left on the shore. 20, 30 years down the pike. So we'll see what happens.
Well, you know, I've been thinking, you see, I went to Papua New Guinea, to New Ireland, where I knew there were these men who still sing and catch sharks. And they believe that their ancestors guide the sharks to them, that there's a connection with their ancestors. So when they go out to fish in these tiny, skinny canoes, they will have ritualized the night before. They won't have sex. They won't eat certain things like flying foxes. They'll catch a little fish and sing songs to the sea before they go out. Then they go out alone and they lure the sharks up with rattles and songs, believing that the ancestor is guiding the shark to them to kill, to eat. And it's one man, one shark. And very sadly now there are less and less sharks there. But I had seen a documentary about this man called Selam. And he had been filmed by Cousteau. And when I went to the island, they thought I was kind of a big film company. And they put a plastic chair under a tree, and they all sat around me and said, they could speak English because pidgin English, and they wanted to know what I was doing. And I saw Selam sitting apart, and they had excluded him, and because they felt he was too old and he could no longer have the magic to catch the sharks. And I went, oh my God, Selam, I saw you on the films and all this. And we became buddies, and he brought me out in a canoe. Now, I think with Selam and beautiful Shogang, the man who caught a shark, and in this book, there's a picture of my father with his buddy on a yacht, and then there's a picture of Shogang with his buddy eating a beetle nut. And it's about place, passion, desire in their boats, doing their daily thing that overlaps in a way. But I think that the sadness I felt, like I left New Ireland just so incredible, because there were these guys who had moved to Papua New Guinea who suddenly knew about money. Up to about a year before we got there, they still used shell money, which is tiny little bits of shell on threads, and depending on the length, it is its value. There was no electricity, no running water, nothing. And it was just on the cusp of this, the disappearance of something that I believe is incredibly pure, which goes back to the very first question about nature, because Selam was being shoved aside because they believed he was old school, and yet the young kids were thinking that maybe they could do the shark calling for tourism, But it won't work like that. And anyway, nobody's going to go to New Ireland. It's in the middle of nowhere. It's not connected to anywhere. And it was just this desperate kind of sadness. Now, I'll tell you a story, though, that was absolutely beautiful. Selam was the old man. He said to me one day, come to my hut. They lived in little palm huts, and he brought me in, and they have black magic and white magic there, and they're very suspicious of each other. And they eat fish and they grow vegetables up in the hills, and they're actually subsistent living. You know, except now the sharks are getting less and less. So he brought me to his hut, and he had a little key tied in his t-shirt, and he opened a box, and inside the box was a canvas bag, another key, he opened that. Inside that was a plastic bag, and inside that was a CD, and a DVD, and he held it up like the Holy Grail. And he said, this is a video of me taken by a German film company. He'd been filmed twice in his life. He had never seen it. And he put it back in, he tied it all up. He was terrified that someone was going to rob it. And it was just unbelievably, it's a crazy thing to say, sad and beautiful. Because this man's whole existence, and maybe I'm silly and naive, but I believe that type of life was very pure. And you know, a lot of my work we haven't spoken about. When I come back to Ireland, I'm an artist. Am I being an art tourist? Am I just going down there to take the energy of those people? And I cannot stand that and put it in a gallery. And I was going, okay, judgment now, Dorothy, judgment. What are you doing with these people? Have you just taken their spirits and turn my back on them? And I did desperately want to go back, and I never went back. And I still feel a little bit guilty that I never went back. But it was one of the hardest places I ever went to. My friend got malaria. It was a tough trip, and but what I tried to do in that, and again maybe I'm talking around the answer to this, is I showed it in a gallery in Dublin called the Curlin, and I had found a broken curragh up the road from me here on a beach, and it was broken bow from stern, and I dragged all the bits back to my studio, and in fact we made a fence in my field to keep the sheep out for about 2 years, and then I put them all back together, except for the bow and the stern. And I found a perfect gannet on the beach that was dead from diving into shallow water and had broken his neck, and got it stuffed by Tony Walsh in Sligo beautifully, and had the gannet flying upside down under a curragh that was fractured. And behind that, I put a video of Selam singing a song. Now, when Selam said to me, you can come with me to go out charcoaling, Dorothy, and I thought, I knew women were not lucky. It's also an Irish fishing boats, I think that we bring bad luck, because it's all tied into kind of sexuality and menstruation and everything. And I said, well, Selam, we won't catch any sharks. And he said he went into the jungle and he got this little bundle of leaves, and he gave them to me, and he said, in the morning before dawn, go to the stream and wash your body with these. So I was up in the pitch black going to this little stream, scrubbing myself with leaves. And then I went out and perilously balanced on this thing. This is about as wide as my thigh, with him singing and ratting. I felt so privileged. But then when we came back on land, we didn't catch any shark. And of course, all the young fellas were gloating that Selam had lost his magic. I was in love with Selam. We interviewed him later under a tree, me and my friend Loring, and he sang a song. And in the middle of it, he started to cry. First, I thought he had something in his eye, and Loring was on the camera, and I was talking to him. And so I saw he was crying, and I went to stop the camera, but he raised his hand, and he continued singing. And in the end, it was in his own language, and in the end, I said, it was heartbreaking. And I said to Selam, what was that song about? And he said, that was a song that I have never sung to anyone before. I only sing that song when I'm alone in the boat, and I've caught a shark, and I'm coming back to land, and it's a song to the spirits. And I said, why are you crying? And he said, I said, do you believe shark calling is dying? And he said, yes. And that's why he exposed this precious private thing to me and my friend from New York City, who were coming back to Europe, you know?
That image, again, I mean, when Dorothy first showed me the gannet and talked about, you know, that commitment that the gannet makes to hitting the water at 1 zillion miles an hour to catching that fish, it's the same. She's the gannet, you know, and I think she does it on our behalf, is to go after whatever she senses, and goes after it 100% and with full passion, and we are indebted to you. Thank you.
Okay.